When Margaret walked into my office, her first words left me frozen. I donated half my liver. I didn't even get a thank you in return, but that's not what brought me here. She paused, her eyes clouded over with something I couldn't immediately identify. What brought me here was realizing I wanted to see her dead on that operating table. 47 years old, a nurse, 25 years saving other people's lives, and this woman had wished death upon her own twin, and that wish was consuming her from the inside. But Margaret's story didn't begin there. This story began in a house where two girls were born with the same face, but only one was loved. And what happened in that house was one of the darkest family secrets I've heard in my 22 years of practice. I wanted to kill my twin. After uttering that sentence, Margaret's body didn't relax. It tensed even more, as if that confession, instead of freeing her, had buried her deeper. But there's something worse, she said. I waited in silence. Maybe, when I wished she would die on the operating table, I actually wanted to kill myself. Because that face is my face. Margaret's eyes weren't looking at me. They were fixed on the mirror on the wall behind my desk, and in that moment I understood. This woman had carried her enemy's face for 47 years. Every time she looked in a mirror, she saw the person she hated most in the world. As a psychologist, I immediately recognized what I was witnessing. Margaret hadn't just suffered relational trauma with her sister. She had developed what we call a fractured identity, where hatred toward another becomes hatred toward oneself, because the separation between the two has become impossible. In some sessions, my patients healed as they spoke, but some stories never left my mind. Today I'll tell you about one of those lives. If you're listening to this story and you also carry things you can't let go of, share in the comments what you feel and where you're listening from. I read every comment. I hear every story. If you want to stay updated on the therapy stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If the story touches your emotions, you can support me by liking. Someday I'd like to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email in my profile. Remember, our stories heal a little when we share them. Margaret sank into the armchair across from me. Her hands rested in her lap, but her knuckles were white from the pressure. She wore her hair pulled back in a severe bun, as if anything out of place might make her crumble. I noticed something peculiar about her posture. Although she spoke of hatred, of wishing her sister dead, her body told a different story. Shoulders dropped, spine curved, chin almost touching her chest. It wasn't the posture of someone who hates. It was the posture of someone who has been defeated. When was the last time you saw Rebecca? I asked. Margaret swallowed hard. 6 months ago, at the hospital, after the surgery. And before that? 30 years. 30 years of silence. And then a call asking for an organ. There was something about this dynamic that disturbed me deeply. What kind of person breaks 3 decades of silence just to ask for part of the body of the one they abandoned? Margaret looked up for the first time. Her eyes, the color of cold coffee, had a glassy quality. You're wondering why I said yes? I didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the most powerful question. I wonder too. Her voice broke on the last word. Every night, every time I see this scar, she touched her left side over her blouse. 30 centimeters. That's how long my stupidity measures. I watched as her fingers trembled over the fabric. There was rage in that gesture, but also something more. Something Margaret probably didn't even recognize in herself. How old were you when you stopped talking to your sister? 16. What happened when you were 16? The change in Margaret was instantaneous. Her breathing accelerated. The muscles in her jaw visibly tensed beneath her skin. Her hands, which had been trembling, went completely still. Frozen. In psychology, we recognize this as a freeze response. The nervous system activating a primitive survival mechanism. When neither flight nor fight are options, the body paralyzes, and Margaret had just paralyzed at a simple question about her adolescence. I don't know if I can talk about that, she whispered. You don't have to do it today. No. She shook her head with a sharp movement. If I don't do it today, I never will. I've been keeping this for 31 years, and it's killing me. Her eyes returned to the mirror, and this time I saw something that chilled my blood. She wasn't looking at her reflection with hatred. She was looking at it with terror. What had happened in Margaret's adolescence that had turned her into a prisoner of her own face? What had Rebecca done that deserved 30 years of silence, and then, inexplicably, the donation of a vital organ? Margaret began to speak, and what she told me would forever change my understanding of what a family can do to a child. "We were born 7 minutes apart," Margaret began. 7 minutes that determined the rest of our lives. Rebecca came out first. I was the one who came after. Her voice had adopted a monotone, almost mechanical tone. I recognized this emotional dissociation as a protection mechanism. Margaret was telling her story from a distance, as if it had happened to someone else. "My mother used to tell the story of our birth at every family gathering. She said that when Rebecca was born, she cried loudly as if announcing her arrival to the world. But I came out in silence. As if she knew she wasn't welcome," my mother would say. And she'd laugh. Everyone laughed. I noticed how Margaret's shoulders hunched even more, the body language of someone trying to become invisible. When we were little, people couldn't tell us apart. Same hair, same eyes, same way of smiling. But my mother found a solution. She dressed Rebecca in pink. She dressed me in gray. "To know who's who," she explained. But the colors weren't coincidental, were they? Pink for the princess, gray for the background. What Margaret was describing was a classic pattern of extreme parental favoritism, but with a particularly cruel twist. In the case of identical twins, where physical differentiation is impossible, parents who need to choose a favorite create artificial differences. These differences become the rejected child's identity. Margaret wasn't just ignored, she was actively constructed as the inferior one. "Did your father participate in this?" I asked. "My father?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "My father was an accountant. He worked 12 hours a day. When he came home, all he wanted was silence and his newspaper. To him, we were interchangeable, two identical girls who represented two more mouths to feed. Did he ever intervene?" "Once." Margaret's eyes darkened with the memory. "I must have been about 8 years old. My mother had organized a birthday party for Rebecca, only for Rebecca. I was locked in my room because there wasn't enough cake for 2 parties. My father came home early that day. He found me looking through the window, watching all the neighborhood kids in the garden, eating my birthday cake too." Margaret paused. Her breathing had become shallow. "What did your father do?" "He came upstairs. I thought he was coming to get me, that he would take me to the party, that finally someone saw me." Margaret's voice reduced to a thread. "He closed my window curtains. He told me, 'Stop looking at what isn't yours,' and he went down to the party." Silence filled my office. I could hear the clock on the wall, each second marking the weight of what Margaret had just revealed. This was a devastating example of what in psychology we call systematic emotional invalidation. The father didn't just ignore his daughter's suffering, he actively communicated to her that her pain was inappropriate. "Stop looking at what isn't yours." With that phrase, he taught Margaret that she had no right even to wish to be included. "How did you survive those years?" The question came out of me with more emotion than I intended to show. Margaret looked directly at me for the first time in several minutes. "I didn't survive. That girl died. What remained was this." She gestured vaguely at herself. "A shell that learned to need nothing, to ask for nothing, to be invisible." But something didn't fit. Margaret had said she stopped talking to her sister at 16. That meant she had endured 16 years in that house. What had specifically happened at that age that broke the bond forever? "Margaret, you mentioned earlier that at 16 everything changed. What happened that year?" The color drained from her face. I literally watched as the blood retreated from her cheeks, leaving her with a cadaverous pallor. "That year, I met someone. The only boy who ever looked at me as if I were real. His name was Daniel." Margaret's voice acquired a different quality when she pronounced that name. Softer, more vulnerable. "He was new at school. He didn't know Rebecca. He didn't know I was the other twin. To him, I was simply Margaret." I observed how Margaret's body subtly transformed as she spoke. Her shoulders relaxed by a centimeter. Her hands stopped gripping. It was like watching someone remove armor they had worn for decades. "How did you meet?" "In the library." A ghostly smile crossed her lips. I spent every recess there. It was the only place where I could exist without Rebecca casting her shadow over me. Daniel was looking for a book about astronomy. I helped him find it. And then, he just kept coming back. This detail seemed significant to me. Margaret had found refuge in the library, a space of silence and solitude. And in that space, someone had finally seen her. How long were you together? 4 months. The smile disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. The best 4 months of my life. Daniel wrote me notes and hid them in my locker. He waited for me after classes. He listened to me talk for hours about nothing important. No one had ever listened to me before. No one. Margaret stopped. Her eyes had moistened, but she wasn't crying. It was as if her body had forgotten how to produce tears. What was your relationship with Rebecca like during that time? Rebecca didn't know Daniel existed. I kept him secret, not out of shame, but out of survival. I knew that if Rebecca found out I had something she didn't have, she would find a way to take it from me. This pattern of concealment revealed a lot about the dynamic between the sisters. Margaret had learned that anything good in her life would be snatched away. That happiness had to be hidden, as if it were a crime. What happened after those 4 months? Margaret closed her eyes. Her breathing became irregular, small inhalations followed by pauses that were too long. There was a party, at the house of one of the soccer team's guys. Daniel invited me. It was the first party I'd ever been to. The first time anyone had included me in anything. She opened her eyes, but her gaze was lost in the past. My mother didn't want to let me go. She said it was inappropriate. But Rebecca intervened. She said she would watch over me. My mother agreed immediately. Anything Rebecca asked for. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what was coming would be devastating. The way Margaret had constructed this narrative, the care with which she had placed each piece, told me we were arriving at the heart of her trauma. Did Rebecca go to the party with you? Rebecca arrived before me. She was wearing a red dress. I was wearing the same gray dress as always. Margaret let out a bitter laugh, devoid of humor. When I walked into the party, I looked for Daniel. I found him in the backyard. A long pause. I could see how Margaret struggled against the words, as if pronouncing them caused her physical pain. He wasn't alone. Who was with him? Margaret looked at me, and in her eyes I saw 31 years of agony concentrated in a single instant. Rebecca, she was kissing him, and when she saw me, she smiled. She looked directly into my eyes and kept kissing him. She wanted me to see it. The deliberate cruelty of this act struck me deeply. Rebecca hadn't seduced Margaret's boyfriend out of attraction or chance. She had done it as an act of calculated destruction, and she had made sure her sister witnessed the exact moment of betrayal. What did you do? I ran. I ran until my legs stopped working. I ended up in a park, in the dark, not knowing how to get home, not wanting to go home. Margaret touched her chest, over her heart. That night something died in here, the part of me that still believed I deserved love. But I knew this wasn't the whole story. Margaret had mentioned she was thrown out of her house at 16. A stolen kiss, as painful as it was, didn't explain that expulsion. Margaret, what happened after that night? Her jaw tightened. Rebecca got pregnant, with Daniel. 2 months after the party, my mother sat us both down in the living room. Margaret now spoke with an unsettling calm, the calm of someone who has repeated this story so many times in her mind that the words have lost their emotional weight. Rebecca was crying. My father was standing by the window, his back to us, and my mother was looking at me as if I were an insect she had found in her kitchen. What did your mother say? She said, Rebecca's told us everything. How could you do this to your own sister? The air in my office became dense. I was beginning to understand the magnitude of what Margaret had faced. What had Rebecca told them? Margaret let out a mirthless laugh. That I had introduced her to Daniel. That I knew she liked him. That I had pushed them to be together because I wanted to humiliate her. And when she got pregnant, she said I had threatened her, that I had told her if she didn't sleep with him, I would tell my parents she had been seeing boys secretly. The reversal of reality was so complete, so monstrous, that for a moment I was left speechless. Rebecca hadn't just stolen her sister's boyfriend, she had constructed a narrative where Margaret was the villain and she was the victim. Did you try to defend yourself? Of course. Margaret's eyes flashed with a glimpse of the old rage. I told them the truth, that Daniel was my boyfriend, that Rebecca had deliberately seduced him, that everything she said was a lie. Did they believe you? The question hung in the air for several seconds. My father turned around, he looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, and he said, I always knew there was something wrong with you. Since you were born, I knew you were different, that you weren't like Rebecca. And then he went back to looking out the window. This moment represented what in psychology we call the confirmed primary wound. Margaret had grown up feeling defective, less than her sister. And in that instant, her own father had verbalized exactly what she most feared, that her intuition had been correct all along, that there really was something wrong with her. And your mother? My mother grabbed my arm, hard. She left marks that lasted a week. Margaret instinctively touched her forearm, as if the bruises were still there. She took me to my room. She told me to pack a bag, that I had 1 hour to leave her house. 1 hour? 1 hour, at 11 at night, in February. I was 16 years old, and they gave me 1 hour to stop being their daughter. What Margaret was describing was parental abandonment in its most brutal form. It wasn't an impulsive decision made in the heat of the moment. Her mother gave her 1 hour, a calculated time. Enough to pack the essentials, but not enough to find alternatives. It was as if she had rehearsed this moment, waiting for it. What did you pack? Almost nothing. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the clothes. I threw in some t-shirts, underwear, my ID documents, a book Daniel had given me. Her voice broke at the mention of the book. I don't know why I took it. I guess it was the only thing that proved someone at some point had loved me. Was your sister present during all of this? Rebecca was sitting on the couch when I came down with my suitcase. My mother by the door, arms crossed. My father had disappeared, probably to his study, avoiding the scene as he always avoided any conflict. Margaret breathed deeply. Rebecca looked at me as I walked toward the door, and she smiled. Not a nervous or uncomfortable smile. A smile of satisfaction, of victory. This detail was crucial to understanding the dynamic between the sisters. Rebecca wasn't simply a teenager who had made mistakes. She was someone who actively enjoyed Margaret's suffering. This suggested personality traits far more disturbing than simple sibling rivalry. I tried to process the enormity of what Margaret was describing. Parents who expel a teenage daughter in the middle of the night, based solely on the word of another daughter, without investigation, without questions, without the slightest benefit of the doubt. Did your mother ever question Rebecca's story? Why would she? Rebecca was the princess. Rebecca was the good one. Rebecca was the one who came out crying from the womb, announcing her arrival. I was the one who came out in silence. The one who shouldn't have been born. Margaret shrugged, a gesture that contrasted brutally with the weight of her words. I think my mother had been waiting 16 years for an excuse to get rid of me. Rebecca gave it to her. Here was pattern I saw all too often in my practice. The family scapegoat. In dysfunctional families, one child is often unconsciously designated as the repository of everything negative, while another is idealized. But Margaret's case was extreme. The physical expulsion represented the logical culmination of years of emotional expulsion. Where did you go that night? Margaret stared at a fixed point on the wall. I walked until dawn. I slept in a bus station. On the third day, a man found me. Her voice changed in that last sentence. It became flatter, more distant, as if she were reciting the facts of someone else's life. What man? His name was Victor. He was 43 years old. He told me he had an extra room in his apartment, that I could stay until I figured things out. I felt my stomach contract. I knew exactly where the story was going. Victor seemed kind at first. Margaret now spoke with her eyes closed, as if she needed to block out the present to immerse herself in the past. He gave me food, clean clothes, a bed. After 3 nights sleeping in stations and parks, that seemed like a palace. How long before things changed? 1 week. 1 week of normalcy, of quiet dinners and conversations about nothing. And then one night, he came into my room. I said nothing. Some moments require absolute silence. It wasn't violent. Not that first time. Margaret opened her eyes, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at something only she could see. He explained that nothing in life was free. That I needed a place to live, and he needed company. He said it was a fair exchange. What Margaret was describing was a textbook pattern of abuse. The isolation of the victim, the creation of dependency, and then gradual exploitation disguised as a mutual agreement. How long were you with Victor? 3 years. 3 years. 1,095 nights of what Margaret still couldn't name for what it really was. Why did you stay so long? Because I had nowhere else to go. Her voice was firm, almost defiant. Because the alternative was the street. Because my family had thrown me away like garbage. Because the only boy I had ever loved preferred my sister. Because... She stopped, swallowing something that seemed like glass. Because Victor, at least, wanted me. In some twisted way, he wanted me. This rationalization of abuse is devastatingly common among trauma survivors. When the world has shown you that you have no value, any attention, even predatory attention, can feel like love. Margaret, what you're describing wasn't an exchange. It was exploitation. You were a minor. I know. She nodded slowly. I know now, but at 16, at 17, at 18, I didn't have the words. I didn't have the frame of reference. Victor didn't hit me. He fed me. He bought me things. He told me I was special. How could that be abuse when my own family had treated me worse? This comparison was revealing and tragic. Margaret had normalized parental mistreatment to such an extent that sexual exploitation seemed, by comparison, an improvement. How did your relationship with Victor end? One day I woke up and I was 19 years old, and I realized I couldn't remember what it had been like to be 16. I couldn't remember Daniel, not clearly. I couldn't remember the party, except as a series of disconnected images. My mind had started to erase itself. Margaret touched her temple, and I thought, if I stay, I'm going to disappear completely. Not physically, but the person I am, the person I could have been, is going to cease to exist. This moment of clarity in the midst of trauma is what we call the adaptive breaking point. Margaret's psychological system, after years of suppression, had finally found a reason to fight. Fundamental self-preservation. What did you do? Victor worked nights at a factory. One Tuesday while he slept, I took all the money I could find, my ID, and walked out the door. I didn't take anything else. I didn't want anything he had touched. Where did you go? To a women's shelter. I stayed there for 6 months. One of the social workers helped me enroll in a high school equivalency program. At 20, I got my diploma. At 21, I entered nursing school. Margaret's resilience was extraordinary. She had been abandoned, exploited, and erased, and yet she had found a way to rebuild herself. You became someone who takes care of others. I became someone who takes care of others, Margaret repeated, because no one took care of me. I thought that if I saved enough lives, if I was good enough, useful enough, maybe I would finally deserve to exist. This motivation for entering helping professions is common among trauma survivors. The healer's wound, trying to heal in others what we couldn't heal in ourselves. Did you ever try to contact your family during those years? Once, when I was 25, I wrote them a letter. I told them where I was, what I was doing. I told them I forgave them. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. How naive I was. What happened? The letter came back unopened. On the envelope in my mother's handwriting was written, "Does not live here." 25 more years passed. Margaret now spoke faster, as if she wanted to get through this part of the story as quickly as possible. I became head nurse at a hospital. I bought a small apartment. I had a routine. I didn't have close friends. I didn't have a partner, but I had peace, or what I believed was peace. What was it really? Numbness. She said it without hesitation. I had built a life where I didn't need anyone, where no one could hurt me because no one could get close. It was like living inside a glass bubble, safe, but completely alone. This self-protective isolation is a common adaptation to relational trauma. When early relationships teach us that intimacy equals pain, we build emotional fortresses, but those fortresses over time become prisons. What broke that bubble? Margaret took a deep breath. 2 years ago I received a call. It was an unknown number. I answered, thinking it was from the hospital. She paused, and I noticed how her hands began to tremble again. It was my mother. Your mother called you after 30 years? Not to apologize, not to see how I was doing. She called to tell me that Rebecca had liver cancer, that she needed a transplant, and that I, as an identical twin, was the perfect donor. The audacity of this request left me momentarily speechless. 30 years of silence, of rejection, of cruelty, and the first contact was a demand for an organ. What did you tell her? I asked her why I should help the person who destroyed my life. My mother said. Margaret closed her eyes. Because she's your sister, and because it's the least you can do after everything you did to her. After everything you did to her, I repeated. 30 years later, and they still believed the lie. They still believed I was the villain of the story. This moment revealed something profound about Margaret's family dynamic. The narrative had been established 3 decades ago, and no amount of time or distance had changed it. For her family, Margaret would always be the guilty one. This is what we call a crystallized family role, where the identity assigned to a member becomes immutable, regardless of evidence to the contrary. What happened after that call? I hung up. I sat on my couch for hours staring at the wall. My head was a chaos of contradictory voices. One part of me screamed not to do it, that it was a trap, that they just wanted to use me once again. But another part, a part I thought I had silenced decades ago, whispered something different. What did it whisper? That if I did it, if I gave them what they wanted, they would finally understand that I wasn't bad, that they would see my sacrifice and say, we were wrong about her, she was always good, that my mother would hug me for the first time since I could remember. Margaret let out a bitter laugh, laden with self-contempt. At 45 years old, I was still fantasizing about my mother's embrace. Could there be anything more pathetic? It's not pathetic, Margaret. It's profoundly human. The desire for parental love has no expiration date. But it should. At a certain age, we should be able to accept that some people simply cannot love, that their incapacity has nothing to do with us. Can you accept that now? Now I can. But then I was still that 6-year-old girl with her nose pressed against the window glass. Why did you say yes? Margaret opened her eyes. In them was something I hadn't seen before. Shame. Because a part of me, a part I hate, still wanted to be loved, still thought, if I do this, if I give them what they want, they will finally see that I'm good, they will finally accept me. I was 45 years old, and I was still that 6-year-old girl looking through the window while others ate her birthday cake. This confession was heartbreaking in its honesty. Margaret had precisely identified the mechanism that had led her to make a decision that, seen from outside, seemed absurd. The hunger for parental acceptance doesn't disappear with age, it just buries itself deeper. How were the preparations for the surgery? Professional. Cold. They ran tests on me for weeks. I never saw Rebecca during that time. All communication was through the hospital. It was as if I were donating to a stranger. And your family? My father had died 5 years earlier. I didn't find out until my mother mentioned it in passing during one of the calls about the transplant. Margaret swallowed hard. My mother came to the hospital once, before the surgery. Not to see me, to make sure everything was in order for Rebecca. The operation lasted 8 hours. Margaret touched her left side, where the scar remained as permanent testimony. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was the white ceiling of the hospital. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Silence? My room was empty. There were no flowers, no cards, none of the rituals I had seen thousands of times as a nurse, when families surrounded their loved ones after major surgery. Margaret shook her head slowly. I had donated half of a vital organ, and I woke up completely alone. The image was devastating. Margaret, who had spent 25 years caring for patients, who knew intimately the importance of postoperative support, abandoned in a sterile room. Did your mother come to see you? On the 3rd day, she walked in, looked around the room as if searching for something that was missing, and said, Rebecca is recovering well. The doctors say the transplant was a success. Then she stood by the door, without approaching my bed. Thank you for doing the right thing, she said, and she left. Thank you for doing the right thing, like settling a debt, as if I had finally paid for a crime I never committed. This moment crystallized the entire tragedy of Margaret's relationship with her family. Even the most extreme sacrifice, giving up part of her own body, had been framed as an obligation, not as an act of generosity. Did you see Rebecca during recovery? Once, on the 5th day, when I could already walk, I went to her room. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see her face. Maybe I was looking for, I don't know, recognition. What did you find? I found her surrounded by flowers, cards. 3 of her children were there. Margaret swallowed with difficulty. She has children, 3. I never knew their names until that day. One of them looked at me and asked his mother, "Who is she?" And Rebecca looked directly into my eyes, like that night at the party, and said, "Nobody important." The parallel with the party 30 years ago was chilling. Rebecca once again looking at Margaret while ripping something away from her. This time it wasn't a teenage boyfriend. It was the hope of redemption. What did you do? I went back to my room. I sat on the bed and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if my body had finally decided it was enough, that it couldn't keep feeling anymore. This emotional numbness is an extreme protection mechanism. When pain exceeds the nervous system's processing capacity, dissociation activates as a last resort. When did you start feeling again? Margaret looked at me with a new intensity. 6 months after the surgery, when I discovered the truth. 6 months after the transplant, I received a letter from the hospital. Margaret now spoke with a completely different voice. Harder, sharper. It was a follow-up survey for donors, one of those routine HR things. What did you discover? The survey came with a case summary, basic information, and there in small print was the fact that changed everything. Margaret pulled a folded paper from her purse. She had brought it, prepared for this moment. Number on waiting list at time of living donor request, 3. Number 3, I repeated, making sure I understood. Rebecca was number 3 on the transplant list. Not number 30, not number 100, number 3. She would have gotten a cadaveric donor in weeks, maybe months. Margaret unfolded the paper with trembling hands. They didn't need me. They never needed me, but Rebecca told the doctors she had a twin sister. And when they asked if she wanted to contact her, do you know what she said? I didn't respond. I knew Margaret needed to say it herself. She said she owes me this. It's in the social worker's notes. Patient indicates that the potential donor has a pending family obligation. A pending family obligation. That's how she described 30 years of silence. That's how she described having stolen everything from me at 16. What Margaret had discovered wasn't just that the donation had been medically unnecessary. It was that Rebecca had orchestrated everything as one final act of power and humiliation. She didn't want Margaret's liver because she needed it. She wanted it because she could take it. What did you feel when you discovered this? At first, nothing. The same emptiness as always. Margaret folded the paper and put it away. But that night, when I got to my apartment and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 16. What did you feel? Rage. The word came out like a gunshot. 31 years of rage concentrated in a single moment. I looked at my reflection, saw her face, and wanted to smash the mirror. I wanted to smash her, and I wanted to smash myself for being so stupid, so pathetically desperate for love, that I gave a piece of my body to someone who never saw me as human. What did you do with that rage? The worst possible thing. Margaret looked down at her hands. I turned it against myself. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I called work to report myself sick and didn't leave my apartment for 3 weeks. Every time I passed a mirror, I closed my eyes. This collapse was understandable from a psychological perspective. Margaret's rage was legitimate, but she had no safe object toward which to direct it. Rebecca was out of her reach. Her parents, one dead and the other unreachable. The only person available to receive that fury was herself. What brought you here to therapy? 3 weeks ago, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror. I had scissors in my hand. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were dry, but her voice trembled. Not to cut my veins, to cut my face. I wanted to destroy the only thing that connected us. I wanted to stop seeing Rebecca every time I looked at myself. What stopped you? I don't know. Something in my head said, if you do this, she wins. If you destroy yourself, Rebecca will have finally killed you. Not with her hands, but with yours. And I dropped the scissors. This moment of clarity was crucial. Even at the lowest point of her crisis, a part of Margaret had recognized the dynamic at play. Self-destruction wasn't rebellion against Rebecca. It was Rebecca's final victory. "Margaret, what do you hope to achieve in therapy?" She thought for a long moment. "I want to be able to look in a mirror and see Margaret, not Rebecca, not the other one, not the girl nobody wanted. I want to see someone who deserves to be alive." She paused. "Is that possible?" The following weeks with Margaret were the most intense of my career. Not because of the severity of her trauma, though it was severe, but because of the depth of her self-awareness and her fierce determination to heal. We worked first on separating her identity from Rebecca's. This required dismantling decades of conditioning. "When you look in the mirror," I told her in our 4th session, "what's the first thing you think?" "There she is." "She who?" "Rebecca. My enemy. The person who took everything from me." "But it's also you, isn't it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "That's the problem. I don't know where I end and where she begins. We share a face. We share DNA. How can I hate her without hating myself?" This was the central question of Margaret's therapy. The fusion of identity with her twin sister had created an apparently impossible psychological trap. "I want you to try something," I told her. "I want you to think of a physical characteristic of yours that you don't share with Rebecca." "We share everything. We're identical." "Everything. Isn't there any scar, any mark, any difference?" Margaret went still. Then slowly she touched her left side. "The scar. The transplant scar. Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Rebecca doesn't have this scar. She has one, but it's different, smaller. She received, I gave. That scar is yours, Margaret. Only yours. Rebecca will never have it. It represents something she can never take from you. What does it represent? That you survived, that you gave a part of yourself and kept living. That even when the whole world treated you as if you didn't matter, your body kept going. That scar is proof that you're a survivor." I saw something change in Margaret's eyes. A flash of something I hadn't seen before. Hope? Curiosity? It was hard to tell. I'd never thought of it that way. "Rebecca took many things from you, but she can't take your story. She can't take the 25 years you spent healing others. She can't take the strength that carried you from a bus station to becoming head nurse. Those are yours." Margaret was silent for several minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, firmer. "My whole life I believed I was the other one, the defective copy. But Rebecca couldn't have done what I did. She couldn't have survived what I survived. She always had everything handed to her. I had to build everything from ashes." "What does that tell you about yourself? That maybe I'm not the inferior one. Maybe I never was." In our 8th session, Margaret arrived with something different in her posture. The shoulders, which had always been hunched forward, were straighter. Her step, usually hesitant, was firmer. "This week I did something," she said as she sat down. "What did you do?" I looked in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in I don't know how long. "What did you see?" Margaret smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but real. "I saw wrinkles that Rebecca doesn't have. She probably injects things. I saw gray hairs. I don't die. I saw tired eyes of a woman who has worked night shifts for 2 decades. What else did you see?" "I saw Margaret." Her voice broke slightly. "Not the other one. Not the copy. I saw a 47-year-old woman who has survived things that should have destroyed her. And I didn't hate her." This was the breakthrough we had been looking for. Margaret's ability to see herself as a separate individual, with her own story, was the first step toward identity integration. In trauma psychology, this is known as self-differentiation, the process by which a person establishes clear boundaries between their identity and that of others, especially those who have been a source of trauma. "How did you feel?" "Sad, but also relieved, like I had been holding my breath for 30 years and could finally exhale." "What do you think caused this change?" "I think it was something you said in our last session, about how Rebecca couldn't have survived what I survived. I'd never thought of it that way. I always saw her as the winner, the favorite, the one who got everything. But she got everything because she never had to fight for anything. I had to fight for every crumb, and that made me strong in ways she'll never understand." I nodded. "Margaret, I want to ask you a difficult question. Are you ready? Yes. Have you thought about forgiving Rebecca? Margaret went still. For a moment, I feared the question had been too soon. I've thought about it, she finally said. Many nights, lying in bed, I've turned that question over, and I came to a conclusion that might surprise you. What? I don't need to forgive her. Not to heal. Forgiveness is something she would have to earn, and she's never tried. She's never apologized. She's never acknowledged what she did. Forgiveness without repentance isn't forgiveness. It's simply accepting more abuse. Margaret looked directly at me. But what I can do is let go. I can let go of the hope that someday she'll change. I can let go of the fantasy that someday my family will see me for who I am. I can let go of the need for their approval. And what remains when you let go of all that? Me. I remain. Just me. And I'm beginning to believe that maybe that's enough. This distinction Margaret had made between forgiveness and letting go was profoundly wise. In our culture, victims are often pressured to forgive as a requirement for healing. But the true work of healing doesn't require reconciliation with the aggressor. It requires reconciliation with oneself. 6 months have passed since my first session with Margaret. Today was our last regular appointment. She'll continue coming monthly for follow-up, but the intensive work is done. Margaret walked into my office differently than that first day. Her posture was no longer that of someone trying to disappear. It was the posture of someone who has decided to occupy space in the world. How do you feel? I asked her. Strange, but good. She sat down and for the first time didn't avoid the mirror on the wall. She looked directly at it for several seconds before turning her attention to me. This week I did something I never thought I would do. What? I went to a home decor store. I bought a mirror. A big one. I hung it in my living room. I couldn't help but smile. Why? Because I'm learning to look at myself. I'm learning to see Margaret instead of Rebecca. And every time I manage it, even for a second, it feels like a victory. This was Margaret's true triumph. She hadn't confronted her sister. She hadn't obtained an apology from her family. She hadn't closed her story in the dramatic way movies make us believe is necessary. Instead, she had done something more difficult and more important. She had reclaimed her own identity. Margaret, before we finish, is there anything you want to say? She thought for a moment. I want to say, thank you. For believing me. For not assuming I was crazy or dramatic. For seeing me. You were always visible, Margaret. You just needed someone who knew where to look. Margaret stood up to leave. At the door, she stopped and turned around. Do you know what's strangest about all of this? What? I no longer wish Rebecca were dead. I don't feel anything anymore when I think about her. It's as if she's finally become irrelevant. She smiled. And that's the best revenge I could have imagined. She left, and I sat in my office thinking about everything Margaret had survived. About the girl who was born 7 minutes after her sister and spent 47 years paying for that delay. About the teenager who was expelled from her home because of a lie. About the woman who gave half her liver hoping for love and received indifference. But I also thought about the woman who bought a mirror, who decided to look at herself, who chose to see herself after a lifetime of being invisible. Margaret was right. That was the best revenge. Not destroying Rebecca, not getting recognition from her family, but simply living, existing, looking in the mirror and seeing someone worth seeing. Some wounds never heal completely. But Margaret had learned something more valuable than total healing. She had learned to live with her scars, and to wear them not as marks of shame, but as proof of survival. I hope this story has helped you see your own life, your emotions, or those around you through different eyes. I hope this story has helped you understand yourself and others a little better. I would love to hear something about you in the comments, to get to know you and your story a little more. If you want to share what's going through your mind, you can write to the email in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. To stay updated on the next real-life story, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to think about them. What do you think about Margaret's story? Does her journey remind you of anything in your own life, or in the lives of people you know? If you were in Margaret's position, would you have donated part of your liver to someone who had caused you so much pain? What would it have taken for you to say no? Do you believe Margaret was right not to forgive Rebecca? Is forgiveness always necessary for healing, or can we heal by simply letting go? What would you say to the 16-year-old Margaret, standing alone on that cold February night with nowhere to go? And what would you say to the 47-year-old Margaret who walked into my office that first day? Have you ever loved someone who hurt you simply because they were the only one who seemed to want you? How did you break free from that pattern? When you look in the mirror, who do you see? Do you see yourself, or do you see someone else's expectations, criticisms, or shadow? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters.